It began with a knock at the door that would change everything. Calvin Rourke had lived most of his 52 years by the rhythm of the land, the Texas sun, the dust on the wind, the hum of cicadas in the evenings. These were the things that marked time for him, not paperwork, not legal filings, and certainly not neighborhood politics. He was up before dawn most mornings, boots on the floor before the coffee finished brewing, because a rancher's work never waited. That Tuesday was supposed to be like any other. The light crept over the horizon in Pine Bluff County, turning the pastures gold. Calvin nursed his first cup of black coffee, standing on his porch, watching the mist rise off the southern pasture. He thought about the fence line that needed mending, about the feed order arriving later that week. Life was steady, simple, and hard, but it was his. The sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. A sleek SUV rolled up, polished to a shine, the kind of vehicle no ranch hand would ever drive across dirt roads. The man who stepped out wasn't from these parts either. Pressed polo shirt, leather shoes without a speck of dust, and an expression as flat as the horizon. He didn't offer a handshake or a greeting, only an envelope and 4 words that landed heavy. "You've been served." Calvin's stomach sank even before he opened it. Inside, cold legal language stared back at him, each word cutting deeper the longer he read. The Pine Bluff Estates Homeowners Association, an entity he had never joined, never paid, never acknowledged, was declaring his 1,500 acres abandoned. They claimed unpaid dues, years of neglect, and a lawful transfer of his ranch to a development company. His father's name was there. His own name was there. And stamped in bold, merciless letters. Transfer of ownership filed. Abandoned. The word tasted bitter. Just last week, Calvin had mowed the southern pasture himself. He had hauled feed, repaired fencing, and driven cattle across that very ground. This was no wasteland. It was the land his family had poured sweat into for generations. The paper shook slightly in his hands. Not from fear, but from fury. His father, Russell Rourke, had warned him of men like this. Men who thought paper could erase history. Men who believed signatures and filings outweighed blood and labor. Russell had handed Calvin the deed years ago with words that stuck like iron. "This land is our backbone. Treat it like it's alive, and it will take care of you." Now, strangers in polished shoes and pressed suits claimed it was gone. That night Calvin sat at his kitchen table, his untouched dinner growing cold, as the notice lay beside his father's worn deed. 2 documents, side by side, one built on decades of labor, the other on manipulation and greed. His eyes burned as he traced the edges of the old parchment, the faded ink of his father's signature. They thought he would fold quietly. They thought he would be too tired, too small, too alone to fight. But they were wrong, because buried somewhere in the files his father had kept, yellowed papers, handwritten notes, and dog-eared maps, was the kind of truth that could turn thieves into tenants, liars into defendants, and neighbors into renters overnight. The knock on his door hadn't just delivered bad news, it had lit a fuse, and Calvin Rourke was about to show the HOA of Pine Bluff Estates what happened when you tried to steal a man's legacy. The morning after, Calvin rose before the sun, not out of routine, but because his mind refused to rest. He walked the boundary of his land, boots sinking into damp earth, every fence post and pasture carrying memories of those who came before him. His grandfather Jasper had bought the first 200 acres back in the 1920s, at a time when black landowners in East Texas were few and far between, and every acre had to be defended against banks, neighbors, and nature itself. His father Russell had doubled and tripled it, weathering droughts, storms, and lean years. Now Calvin stood as the steward of 1,500 acres, each acre a chapter in his family's story, and with one envelope, they were trying to wipe it all away. By noon, Calvin was pacing his porch when Donovan Pike, his longtime neighbor, stopped by to borrow a wrench. Calvin handed him the notice, watching Donovan's face darken as he read. The disbelief, the anger, the recognition, it was all there. Donovan muttered the name Calvin already knew would be behind it. Priscilla Kavanaugh. Priscilla, the HOA president of Pine Bluff Estates, the queen of polished meetings and ruthless enforcement. A woman who had been whispering for months about development, growth, and the future of the county. Now Calvin saw her plan clearly. strip him of his land on paper, flip it to developers, and bury him under a pile of legal jargon. But if Priscilla thought Calvin was just another obstacle to bulldoze, she hadn't counted on the Rourke family's stubbornness. He might not have the polish of a lawyer or the money of a developer, but he had something stronger: history. And history, he was about to learn, had left him a weapon. For when Calvin dug through his father's old files, past the tax receipts and weathered deeds, he would uncover a note scribbled in Russell's steady hand. A note that pointed to an agreement so powerful, it would not just stop the HOA in their tracks. It would flip the balance of power entirely. The land they thought they had stolen wasn't lost. The land they had built their homes on wasn't theirs. And soon, the Pine Bluff Estates HOA would learn the bitterest lesson of all. They weren't Calvin's conquerors. They were his tenants. And the fight had only just begun. The old filing cabinet in Russell Rourke's office was a beast. Heavy steel, scratched and dented from decades of use, it sat in the corner of the ranch house like an immovable sentinel. Calvin hadn't opened it in years. His father had always been meticulous, keeping records on everything from cattle vaccinations to rainfall tallies. When Russell passed, Calvin kept the habit of jotting notes in ledgers, but the cabinet remained mostly untouched, a dusty vault of history. Now, as the summer sun bled into the horizon, Calvin dragged the cabinet drawers open one by one. Folders slid out, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust. Property taxes from the 1950s, crop rotation plans, maps marked with fencing boundaries. It was overwhelming at first, a flood of paperwork that seemed endless. But Calvin knew what he was looking for. His father had mentioned it once, years ago, in passing. An agreement made before Pine Bluff Estates had even existed. Hours passed. The cicadas droned outside, night creeping into the corners of the ranch house. Then, buried beneath a stack of weathered correspondence, Calvin found it. A thin folder, unassuming, but labeled in his father's unmistakable handwriting. Kavanaugh Agreement, 1968. Calvin's pulse quickened. He sat at the desk, hands steady but heart racing, and unfolded the yellowing pages. It was a contract. Formal, notarized, and signed by none other than Harlan Kavanaugh, Priscilla's late father. The same Kavanaugh family that now ran Pine Bluff Estates had once stood in Calvin's father's kitchen, hat in hand, asking for a deal. The terms were simple but devastating. In exchange for access to water rights and the permission to carve a roadway across the Rourke property, rights without which Pine Bluff Estates could never have been developed, the Kavanaugh family had agreed to a binding lease arrangement. Every acre of land upon which their subdivision now stood was acknowledged in writing as sitting on Rourke ground. The homeowners could live there, yes, they could build their fancy houses, plant their manicured lawns, but legally the soil belonged to the Rourkes. The homeowners were tenants. Rent was due annually, payable to the Rourke family, or else the land reverted back. And Russell had kept every payment slip, dozens of them signed and dated from the 1970s all the way into the 1990s. Then, at some point, the payments had quietly stopped. The HOA had risen in power, Priscilla's influence had spread, and the history of the arrangement had been buried, forgotten by most, but not erased. Calvin leaned back in his chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. The HOA thought they had stripped him of his land, but the truth was sharper, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. By the very terms Priscilla's own father had agreed to, Calvin wasn't just the owner of his ranch, he was the landlord of Pine Bluff Estates itself. The power shift was dizzying. If he moved carefully, strategically, he could drag their entire operation into the light. Every letter they had mailed, every fine they had levied, every threat they had issued, it was all built on borrowed ground. The next morning, Calvin drove into town. His truck rattled along the county road, dust rising behind him like a banner. At the courthouse, he requested a copy of the original filing, his hand steady as he watched the clerk disappear into the archives. When she returned, the weight of the stamped, sealed document landed in his grip like a weapon fully loaded. It was real. Ironclad. Legally binding. On the drive home, Calvin's mind spun with possibilities. He could walk into the next HOA meeting and slam the papers on the table, watching Priscilla's painted face drain of color. He could hire a lawyer, sue for decades of unpaid rent, and force the estate into bankruptcy. He could evict them, one house at a time, until Pine Bluff Estates was nothing but a ghost town of empty McMansions. But Calvin wasn't reckless. His father had taught him that too. The land didn't reward impulse, it rewarded patience, strategy, and persistence. If you wanted to reap a good harvest, you didn't scatter seed in the wind. You studied the soil, waited for the rain, and planted carefully. So Calvin began his quiet preparations. He photocopied every document, storing the originals in a fireproof safe. He organized payment records into neat stacks, building a timeline no court could ignore. He even drove out to see Donovan Pike again, handing him a single page to read. Donovan's eyes widened as he scanned it, then flicked up to Calvin with disbelief. Calvin didn't say much. He didn't need to. Donovan knew. The land under his very house wasn't his at all. Word spread in whispers. A few trusted neighbors learned the truth. Some were stunned, others angry, and a few downright terrified. What would happen if Calvin demanded the rent back? What if he forced the HOA to dissolve? For decades, the Pine Bluff Estates HOA had wielded its rules like a whip. Fines for tall grass, penalties for paint colors, threats of foreclosure for missed dues. Now the whip was broken, and in its place was a noose tightening around their own necks. By the time Priscilla caught wind of the rumors, it was already too late. She called Calvin directly one sweltering afternoon, her voice sharp, demanding, dripping with condescension. He let the phone ring until it went to voicemail. When she showed up at his gate in her spotless SUV, honking until the cattle stirred in the pasture, Calvin stayed inside, the documents spread out on his kitchen table like cards in a winning hand. Priscilla thought she was playing poker with a rancher too stubborn to fold. What she didn't realize was that Calvin had the ace of spades tucked neatly up his sleeve. And when he played it, the HOA wouldn't just lose the hand, they'd lose everything. For as long as anyone could remember, Pine Bluff Estates had been Priscilla Cavanaugh's kingdom. She ruled it with the clipped tones of official letters, with meetings that felt more like inquisitions than gatherings, and with a network of loyal board members who never dared to cross her. She thrived on control of appearances, control of behavior, control of people. But control is fragile. It takes years to build, and only a single fracture to unravel. And that fracture appeared the moment whispers of the Kavanaugh Agreement began spreading. It started small, as all revolutions do. Donovan Pike was the first to let it slip, an offhand remark at the gas station about Rourke owning half the neighborhood. The words traveled fast, picked up like seeds on the prairie wind, carried from one ear to another. By the time the rumor reached the Pine Bluff Estates poolside gathering that weekend, it was no longer a whisper, but a wildfire. "Did you hear?" one woman asked, lowering her sunglasses. "They say the land isn't even ours," another murmured, clutching her lemonade glass tighter. "Rourke's got papers on it," a man added grimly. "Old ones, real ones." The gossip struck nerves deeper than Priscilla anticipated. For decades, she had built her empire on the illusion of permanence, that the homes of Pine Bluff were not just houses, but legacies, that every manicured lawn and freshly painted fence represented stability and status. Now, doubt crept in. If the soil under their feet wasn't truly theirs, then what was all their effort worth? Priscilla tried to stamp out the panic. She summoned an emergency HOA board meeting, chairs scraping across the floor of the clubhouse as her hand-picked committee members gathered around the long mahogany table. The air hummed with tension. She stood at the head of the table, perfectly composed in a pressed blazer, her pearls gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "These rumors are baseless," she declared, her voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. "Calvin Rourke is a bitter man clinging to outdated papers that mean nothing in a modern court. Pine Bluff Estates was established legally. We hold the deeds. This community is ours." But the cracks in her armor were already showing. Some of her board members shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. One finally spoke. "If the papers are real, maybe we should at least check." Priscilla's jaw tightened. Her entire empire depended on certainty. Doubt was poison, and it was spreading fast. Meanwhile, Calvin moved deliberately, never in haste, never revealing too much too soon. He knew his father's lesson well. A storm is most dangerous not when it arrives suddenly, but when it gathers slowly, silently, until the sky blackens and the world realizes too late it cannot escape. He began with subtle strikes. A letter, drafted by his attorney, sent directly to Priscilla and the HOA board. Inside, a single page, a copy of the 1968 agreement, highlighted with the clause declaring Pine Bluff Estates land leased under Rourke ownership. It wasn't a threat, not yet, just a reminder, a seed planted. Priscilla received the letter on a Thursday morning. She read it once, twice, 3 times, her hand trembling slightly as she poured herself another cup of coffee. She tried to laugh it off, tried to dismiss it as irrelevant. But the seal from the county courthouse at the bottom of the copy silenced her laughter before it even began. By that evening, she had her lawyer on the phone demanding reassurance, but even he sounded hesitant. "It's peculiar," he admitted. "Unusual, but technically binding. At least it could be. If challenged in court, there's a chance the HOA would face serious consequences." Priscilla slammed the phone down, her heart pounding. For the first time in years, she felt the cold edge of fear pressing against her ribs. While she scrambled, Calvin kept moving quietly in the background. He made copies of payment records and slipped them into envelopes, delivering them discreetly to a handful of Pine Bluff residents who had long been thorns in the HOA's side. These were the homeowners who had fought back against unfair fines, who had been humiliated at board meetings, who had nearly lost their homes to Priscilla's overreach. Now, Calvin gave them something they had never had before, proof that Priscilla's power was not absolute. And once they saw it, their bitterness ignited into something sharper. One by one, Pine Bluff residents began to push back. A man who had been fined for planting roses instead of approved shrubs tore up his violation notice and mailed it back to the HOA office with Calvin's document tucked inside. A young couple who had been threatened with foreclosure stopped attending board meetings altogether, ignoring the HOA's letters with newfound confidence. Even Donovan Pike, once compliant and cautious, stood up at the next HOA meeting and asked directly, "Is it true? Does Rourke own this land?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Priscilla, for once, had no immediate answer. Her empire, once so orderly, so pristine, began to falter. Rules were ignored. Dues went unpaid. Homeowners whispered openly about organizing against the board. Every desperate letter she sent, every threat she issued was met with defiance backed by Calvin's documents. And Calvin? He watched it all unfold from his porch, coffee in hand, the wide expanse of his father's land stretching before him. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. For the first time in years, he felt not the weight of defeat, but the thrill of possibility. Priscilla had always believed she was the queen of Pine Bluff. But now, piece by piece, Calvin was proving the truth. She was nothing more than a tenant in his kingdom, and kings don't bow to tenants. Priscilla Kavanaugh had never lost. Not once, not in her personal life, not in her reign over Pine Bluff Estates. Losing was for people with weaker wills, looser spines, and smaller visions. She believed herself carved from sterner stuff. So when Calvin Rourke began pulling threads from the carefully woven tapestry of her empire, she didn't retreat. She attacked. The first strike came cloaked in professionalism. A letter, hand-delivered by a courier in a crisp navy uniform, landed on Calvin's doorstep. The letterhead bore the name of one of the state's most expensive law firms. Inside, the words dripped with polished menace. A cease and desist order accusing Calvin of harassment, intimidation, and slander against the Pine Bluff Estates Homeowners Association. The letter warned that unless he immediately ceased spreading false documents and defamatory claims, the HOA would pursue damages in excess of $1 million. Calvin read it slowly, his expression calm, the faintest hint of amusement tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't toss it aside. Instead, he folded it neatly, slid it into a folder already fat with records, and placed it on his shelf. It was exactly the kind of letter his father would have expected. Bluff and bluster, nothing more. But Priscilla didn't stop there. She knew lawsuits were expensive, slow, and uncertain. So she reached for her second weapon, fear. One by one, Calvin's allies in Pine Bluff received unexpected visitors. A board member knocked on doors under the guise of friendly chats. subtly warning homeowners that aligning with Calvin would make them targets for hefty fines and aggressive enforcement. Some residents found anonymous letters in their mailboxes, filled with ominous phrases: "Protect your family," "Don't gamble with your home." The HOA never forgets. It was intimidation dressed in civility, but everyone knew exactly where it came from, and though some wavered, others only hardened in their resolve. If anything, Priscilla's tactics confirmed what Calvin had been quietly showing them, that her power was nothing but a cage, and cages are meant to be broken. Still, Priscilla wasn't finished. She wielded her sharpest tool of all, the art of the smear. Within weeks, a rumor mill spun faster than it ever had before. She whispered into the right ears at church, dropped hints over cocktails at country club gatherings, and let carefully chosen concerns slip in PTA meetings. The narrative was crafted with precision. Calvin Rourke was unstable, dangerous, a bitter man consumed by resentment trying to drag the neighborhood into ruin. By the time her stories filtered down, Calvin had been painted as everything from a failed farmer drowning in debt to a recluse plotting revenge against his neighbors. One particularly wild rumor even claimed he was planning to bulldoze Pine Bluff Estates and replace it with a trailer park once he gained control. To Priscilla, perception was power. If she could make Calvin a villain in the eyes of Pine Bluff, she could isolate him. And isolation, she believed, would crush him faster than any lawsuit. But Calvin didn't bend. He went about his days as though untouched by her campaign. He mowed his fields, attended town council meetings with quiet dignity, and even waved politely when neighbors passed. Where Priscilla burned her energy in whispers and threats, Calvin spent his time building something stronger: trust. On Saturday afternoons, he invited small groups of neighbors to his home. He served them coffee, spread his father's documents across the dining room table, and let them read every line for themselves. No embellishment, no manipulation, just truth. It was this transparency that undid Priscilla's careful lies. The more people saw with their own eyes, the less power her rumors held. And worse, every time she tried to discredit him, the contrast between his quiet steadiness and her frantic hostility grew sharper. Still, the Queen of Pine Bluff was not one to give up easily. Her next move was bold, even reckless. She called for a special community-wide meeting at the clubhouse. Invitations were sent to every homeowner, printed on thick cardstock with the HOA seal embossed at the top. The message was clear: this was no ordinary meeting. It was a showdown. When the night arrived, the clubhouse brimmed with tension. The walls, lined with portraits of past HOA presidents, seemed to lean inward, as though eager to witness the spectacle. Residents filled every chair, some standing along the walls, all waiting to see who would blink first. Priscilla stood at the front, perfectly coiffed, her pearls gleaming under the lights. She cleared her throat, her voice rising above the restless murmurs. "Neighbors," she began, "we are gathered tonight because one man has sought to undermine everything we have built. Calvin Rourke wants to tear down Pine Bluff Estates, to destroy the order, beauty, and value of our homes. He waves old papers and calls them truth, but I call them what they are: relics of the past, irrelevant and dangerous to our community." She spoke with fire, her hands slicing the air, her words calculated to ignite fear. And for a moment she saw nods in the crowd. She saw faces tightening in agreement. But then, Calvin stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture wildly. He simply held up a folder thick with yellowed pages. His father's legacy, the truth in ink. "I'm not here to destroy Pine Bluff," he said evenly. "I'm here to remind you of what it really is. This land has always been Rourke land. My father leased it in good faith. Your homes stand on soil that was never yours. You pay dues to an HOA that has overstepped its authority for years. And here, in black and white, is the proof." He laid the papers on the table at the front, within reach of anyone brave enough to step forward. The silence that followed was heavy. Then slowly one resident stood and approached. They flipped through the pages. Then another joined. Then another. The tide was shifting, not with fire, not with bluster, but with quiet truth. And Priscilla knew it. For the first time in her reign, she felt the ground beneath her heels tremble. Her empire wasn't crumbling because of Calvin's rage. It was crumbling because of her own fear. Priscilla Kavanaugh had built her reputation on one belief. When pressure mounted, you didn't crumble. You escalated. And now, with Calvin Rourke eroding her grip on Pine Bluff Estates, escalation became her only path forward. The special meeting at the clubhouse had rattled her. She could still see the faces of homeowners leaning over Calvin's papers, their eyes widening with dawning realization. She could still hear the silence that followed, a silence heavier than applause, heavier than booze. It was the silence of doubt, and doubt was poison to power. Priscilla couldn't afford poison, so she reached higher. Her first step was the county office. For years she had cultivated allies there, clerks and supervisors who owed her favors or feared her wrath. She swept into the county recorder's office like a queen entering her court, demanding audits of Calvin's records, searches for loopholes, flaws, or expired statutes. The clerk scurried, combing through stacks of legal texts and property codes. But what they brought back left her cold. The Rourke documents were airtight. Signed, sealed, recorded decades ago, their language explicit. The land had never been sold outright, only leased. The HOA had no legal foundation for permanent authority. Priscilla left the office with her smile still painted on, but her stomach knotted tight. If the county wouldn't save her, she would go higher still. Within days, she was on the phone with a state senator she had once entertained at her home. At luncheons and fundraisers, she had poured his wine, stroked his ego, whispered promises of donations. Now she reminded him of those moments, her tone velvet but edged with steel. This man, Calvin Rourke, is threatening hundreds of families, she said. He wants to destroy a thriving community. Surely the state has an interest in protecting homeowners from such chaos. The senator listened politely, distantly. When he finally spoke, his answer was careful. Mrs. Kavanaugh, if his documents are valid, there may be little the state can do. It's a legal matter, not legislative. It was a rebuke dressed in politeness, but Priscilla heard the truth. Even her political capital was drying up. That night, alone in her immaculate living room, she paced like a caged animal. The chandeliers gleamed overhead, but their light felt harsh, unforgiving. For the first time in years, she poured herself a second glass of wine. Yet desperation breeds creativity. And soon her mind turned to her oldest, sharpest weapon, fear through force. 2 weeks later, Calvin Rourke awoke to the crunch of tires on his gravel driveway. A county sheriff's cruiser rolled up, its lights flashing silently. 2 deputies stepped out, their expressions stern. "Mr. Rourke," one said, "we've had complaints, multiple reports of harassment and threats against residents. We'll need you to come down to the station for questioning." Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as Calvin was escorted into the cruiser. Whispers spread like wildfire. Had Priscilla finally nailed him? Was this the end of his crusade? But Priscilla had underestimated the man she sought to bury. At the station, Calvin said little. He simply slid a thick binder across the desk to the deputies, meticulously kept logs, copies of every letter, every threat, every falsified fine from the HOA. The documents weren't accusations, they were evidence. By the time the deputies finished reviewing the binder, their posture had shifted. They no longer looked at Calvin like a suspect. They looked at him like a man targeted by something bigger. He was released without charges that same afternoon. And when he returned home, the sight was stunning. A cluster of neighbors waiting by his gate, some clapping, others simply standing in solidarity. Word had already spread that the sheriff's stunt had failed. Priscilla, watching from her bay window across the way, felt the world tilt. Her every move had backfired. Her influence was slipping like water through her fingers, and the harder she clenched, the faster it drained away. Still, she refused to concede. If she couldn't win with politics, law, or intimidation, she would win with spectacle. The next HOA meeting, she announced, would be the largest in Pine Bluff history. She sent out glossy invitations, hired a professional speaker to frame Calvin as a threat to neighborhood stability, and even brought in a local news crew to film. It would be her last stand. She would either crush Calvin in the public eye, or she would watch her empire collapse under the weight of its own lies. The night of the grand HOA assembly arrived like the opening of a play, and Priscilla Kavanaugh was its self-declared star. The Pine Bluff clubhouse had been polished until it gleamed. Flowers at every table, glossy banners proclaiming, "Preserving our community's future," and a camera crew positioned strategically at the back. Priscilla stood at the podium in a tailored navy suit, her pearls gleaming under the lights. She had stacked the room with loyalists in the front rows, neighbors she had favored over the years with petty exemptions and whispered promises. The rest of the room, however, was filled with faces hardened by months of resentment and fear. This was not the court she remembered ruling with ease. This was a crowd split in two, waiting for blood. The meeting began with practiced ceremony. Priscilla spoke first, her voice sharp and commanding. She painted Calvin Rourke as a rogue landowner, a man stirring unrest, a danger to the order and safety of Pine Bluff Estates. She waved at the cameras, appealing to an imagined audience beyond the room. "This community," she declared, "was built on discipline, on rules, on shared values. Without the HOA, everything collapses. Property values plummet, safety vanishes, chaos reigns, and Mr. Rourke—" She paused, her finger stabbing the air toward the back of the room. "Is the face of that chaos." The applause that followed was loud but not unanimous. It came mostly from the first rows, her loyal circle. From the middle and back of the room there were murmurs, shifting feet, crossed arms. Then Calvin Rourke stood. He didn't move to the podium. He didn't need to. He carried only a leather folio under his arm and the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove. "Mrs. Kavanaugh speaks of rules," he said, his voice steady, carrying through the tense silence. "But she forgets one truth. Rules mean nothing without legitimacy. And tonight, I will show you who truly owns this land, and what authority, if any, the HOA has ever held." Gasps rippled as Calvin handed copies of his documents row by row, neighbors passing them along like sacred texts. The county leases, the expired covenants, the historical deed that bore the Rourke name. Every paper stamped, signed, notarized. The news crew's cameras zoomed in. Even those watching from the back could see the official seals glinting under the lights. Priscilla's smile faltered, then froze altogether. Calvin continued, his tone not angry but resolute. "This HOA has not been protecting you. It has been exploiting you. For years, fines were fabricated, liens illegally threatened, funds siphoned with no oversight. You were told you had no choice. That is a lie. The truth is simple. Without your consent, without lawful foundation, this HOA holds no power. And as of tonight," he raised a hand, "I revoke any claim it pretends to hold." A heavy silence fell. Then voices rose. Not the polite murmurs of uncertainty, but the raw sound of neighbors finally grasping freedom. "This means we don't owe them anything?" one man shouted. "They can't fine us anymore?" a woman asked, clutching the documents in her hand. Calvin nodded. "You owe them nothing they did not lawfully earn." The room erupted, not in chaos, but in release. Decades of bottled resentment came out as cheers, laughter, even tears. Homeowners hugged each other, the weight of years lifting in an instant. Priscilla slammed her hand against the podium, the sharp crack echoing over the din. "This is fraud," she shrieked. "Lies! You can't!" But her words drowned beneath the wave of her own undoing. The news crew, sensing the climax, swung their cameras toward her, capturing every twitch of her unraveling composure. Neighbors she once ruled over turned their backs on her, literally standing to face Calvin instead. Her empire was gone. Priscilla, once the unchallenged queen of Pine Bluff Estates, stood alone at her podium, her voice lost in the roar of liberation. Calvin, for his part, didn't gloat. He simply gathered his folio, turned, and walked out of the clubhouse into the cool night air. Behind him, the community he had freed surged with a new energy, the first breath of independence they had taken in years. By morning, word would spread across the county. The cameras had captured everything: the documents, the crowd, Priscilla's collapse. The HOA's power was finished, and though battles might come in courtrooms and headlines, the truth was settled. The HOA was no longer queen. Priscilla Kavanaugh had fallen, and Calvin Rourke had done what no one thought possible. He had set Pine Bluff Estates free.